Hello again, everybody, and welcome to the LSU Sports Insider podcast. It's Monday, December the 2nd. I'm Zach Ewing with Koki Riley and Wilson Alexander here in our Baton Rouge studios. Trusting you all had a good holiday weekend, and now it's kind of time to turn the page from the holiday. It's also time to turn the page from LSU's 2024 football season. They ended the regular season with a 37-17 win over Oklahoma on Saturday, guys. Whit Weeks was just named Defensive Player of the Week. He had 15 tackles. Not going to spend too much time there. LSU still has a bowl game to come to, but Wilson, it's really time to start talking about offseason mode. The offseason in college football starts so early nowadays that we really have to turn the page right away.
Absolutely. And I mean, I feel like everybody around LSU started looking toward 2025 now for the last couple of weeks anyway. But yes, now that the regular season is over, time to look in that direction. And even Brian Kelly was doing it post-game, starting to spin things forward, talking about how, they haven't announced yet, but how he says they're going to have some key players come back, and talking about some very confident statements about how they're still on the track to win a national championship with this program.
Wilson,
and things like
we'll
that.
See you in the national championship game.
That's right. I wonder what year we'll see LSU in the national championship game, but that's what this whole offseason is about. It's about trying to get back to that place. It's been 5 years now since LSU won the national title. Been really up and down since then. Changed head coaches and all that. Now we're heading into heading out of Brian Kelly's third year into his fourth season, and it's a really critical offseason for this team as they try to make this roster much more better. Golly, am I a journalist? Do I know English? Good Lord, what was that?
It gets harder when you're in front of a camera.
That was just, I don't even know what that was. Okay.
It's the Mike Could of...
I think we're going to need to give me like a 5-minute timeout. Y'all keep talking.
Look, you know what it reminded me of when Kelly said that, we'll see you in the national championship game, is every now and then you'll see a college basketball coach say, we've already made our hotel reservations for the Final Four in Phoenix or wherever it is. And it's like, yeah, every coach goes to the Final Four, so of course you made hotel reservations. So I don't know. Maybe Brian Kelly will be at this year's national championship game, but the rest of the team won't be. So LSU goes 8-4. You mentioned it, Wilson. The most interesting thing I think BK said was that they're expecting several, quote, key players to come back. And so what we're going to do in today's show is kind of go through some of the players that he may have meant and hazard a prediction on whether they will come back or not. So we're going to do that after our first break. Also want to let you know that today's show is brought to you by Waste Pro. Tiger fans, if you're planning a tailgate or event, keep your guests comfortable with portable toilets from Waste Pro. Call 225-744-6400 and mention the LSU Sports Insider for a special offer. So with that said, we'll take a break. We'll be back with some of our talk about these key players returning right after this.
Experience the convenience and cleanliness that Waste Pro brings to Mardi Gras, LSU tailgates, and festivals with our top-notch portable toilet services. Perfect for large crowds and community events. Join the countless satisfied families and organizers who trust Waste Pro to keep their gatherings spotless and sanitary. Discover more about our services and make your next event a success at wasteprousa.com.
There's no better place to parlay than Caesars Sportsbook. Parlay Builder gives you all the game day action from all across the league. Multiple games, legs, and props, all in one spot. It's so quick and easy, you can keep your focus on the games and your nachos. Or if you're focusing on one game, remember, you can place your same game parlays live during the action. Caesars Sportsbook, the only sportsbook app with Caesars rewards.
All right, so as mentioned for today's show, talking about interesting comment by Brian Kelly after Saturday night's game about key players returning and how we're going to get some news on that here in the next, couple of weeks. And look, these players will make the star players of next year's team, and today's star player segment is proudly sponsored by Waste Pro. Ensure your tailgate or event is a hit with clean and convenient portable toilets from Waste Pro. Rent yours today. First guy to talk about, and I think he's kind of the key to the whole thing, especially after LSU loses Bryce Underwood to Michigan in recruiting. The key to the whole thing is the quarterback, and it's Garrett Nussmeier.
Brian Kelly twice last week, once first at his radio show and then again post-game Saturday, came real close to saying that Garrett Nussmeier is coming back without actually crossing over the line. He qualified it both times by saying hopefully but it was the way that he said it, the context in which he talked about it, that continued to reinforce the idea that things are trending in that direction with Garrett Nussmeier. Garrett Nussmeier was asked about it directly on Saturday if he's coming back next season. He said that he has not made a decision yet, that was something he was waiting till after the season to do, to sit down and actually have those conversations. But I think, Garrett Nussmeier's draft stock has shifted a lot over the second half of the season. In the middle of the year, in a particularly weak quarterback class, he was starting to get talked about as maybe the first quarterback off the board. That's not going to be the case. And now it's also really unclear exactly where he would fall in the draft. A guy with his potential might end up being an early round pick. His arm talent is impressive. Teams could, make maybe even reach on him a little bit in order to kind of get them in their franchise and try to build around him. But for Garrett Nussmeier, I think there's a couple of important things to remember that influenced his decision to stay at LSU when he could have transferred a couple years ago, to wait to be the starter, that I feel like are important again here, factors that are probably going to come to mind. And he referenced one of them when we asked him about whether or not he's coming back on Saturday, which is just how much he loves this place. He stuck around to be here. He thinks of himself as a Louisiana native, even though he moved so much. And he really wants to have success at LSU. Back in August, when I got to sit down with Garrett, his phone background was still the national championship trophy. That's something that he wants to win, and he hasn't come close to doing. And I think there's those sorts of motivations. There's also the whole developmental side of things. Garrett struggled a little bit during the season, especially in the biggest games against Texas A&M and against Ole Miss and against Alabama. Obviously, he came back and played brilliantly at the end of the Ole Miss game, but had a couple of interceptions in that game, really low completion percentage. And then there was that 6-quarter stretch in the second half of Texas A&M and the whole Alabama game where he was so turnover prone. And he talked about how that's something he's going to have to improve in the offseason. And that was the thing. He even mentioned like a couple times almost like things that he and this team has to do during the offseason. So he didn't say it himself either, but sort of it feels like things are moving in that direction. Remember, Garrett's dad is a quarterback's coach. He knows what it takes to be successful at that position in the NFL. And Garrett, I think he and his family might sit down and see, like, look, another year of development at the college level, you could come in and be much more ready for the NFL. Because there's still a lot of areas where Garrett needs to get better. We already mentioned the turnovers. Also, just as a downfield passer, he was really hit and miss this season. Finally hit some in this last game against Oklahoma, but that wasn't necessarily very consistent. And Brian Kelly said it's something they've been working on. Imagine with a full offseason development, if you can take a step like we've seen guys take in their second years as starters here at LSU over the past 5-6 years, imagine where he can be in those elements of his game. And then there could be no doubt that he's a first-round pick. So if I'm sitting here today, my prediction is that Garrett Nussmeier comes back to be at LSU again next season.
And Scott Ravelli's mentioned this a couple times throughout the season, even when Nuss was projected to be like a first half of the first-round pick, saying, I think he should come back. And he's pointing to the leaps made by both Joe Burrow and Jaden Daniels in their second year in this program. Not to say Garrett Nussmeier is going to win the Heisman Trophy next year, but like Joe Burrow, had he come out after the 2018 season, he's not the number one pick in the draft. Might not have even been a first-round pick. And he ended up being number one with a bullet. I mean, any of the 32 NFL teams would have taken Joe Burrow number one that year. So you can make that sort of a leap. Jaden Daniels is the number 2 pick in the draft. I don't know that we're expecting that necessarily, Koki, but certainly there's room to grow for Nuss. And if he wants to be back, LSU has a hole there. I mean, that's why him returning is kind of the key to the offseason. And our Key to the Game segment is always sponsored by Associated Grocers. Join our team and support the success of local independent retail grocers. Apply today for available positions at Associated Grocers. But Koki, I assume you agree with all of that.
Yeah, Wilson said it all pretty beautifully, actually. And I guess the only...
You flatter me too much.
I guess the only thing I would add is...
Could you say it more better, though?
Not quite. I thought about it, but no. The only thing I'll add is that, like, Garrett Nussmeier's just not started a lot of games. He started one game in his entire career before the season started, and it was the bowl game last year against Wisconsin. And I mean, the fact that he just needs more playing time and experience, and it's not just to prevent the turnovers. That's obviously a big part of it, but it's also to knowing when to check out of a run or a pass, knowing improving progressions to getting that to a further step. And just, taking the next steps necessary to, sort of fortify, to sort of help NFL teams learn what kind of starting quarterback he is. And so he can just sort of gain some even more confidence as to who he is as a quarterback himself. And I feel like we all have this sort of thought that he's this very, that he knows what he's doing as a starting quarterback because he's been in this program for so long, because he's very polished with the media, because his dad was a quarterback's coach. But the reality of the situation is he hasn't been on the field that much. And I think it's better to get those sort of reps in the college level than in the NFL, where you don't really get a lot of time to develop. You're just sort of thrown in there and thrown to the wolves, and you better be ready.
And I think that's the key piece is like, how ready would he be day one? Because depending on where he gets drafted, which team takes him, they might need him to start very early. And we've seen this league chew up and spit out quarterbacks who aren't quite ready for it yet. The game speed is so much different. And there were times when Garrett seemed to let the game speed kind of affect him, especially in that, like we said, when he was really turnover prone at times. It felt like he was having to adjust to that. So if he has a second season where he's in total command, then it looks like you're going into the NFL, and there's still an adjustment period there, getting ready for the NFL, but you're probably more ready for that if you come back and start a full second season. Like you said, get a lot more experience, a lot more game reps than you would if you were to leave this year, and you're still trying to be, you're still trying to catch up in those phases of your development, going into an even higher level and trying to adjust to that kind of speed of the game. It'd be not impossible, but I feel like that's a tougher situation that you're putting yourself in, as opposed to coming back and continuing to mature at the college level, as opposed to just throwing yourself into the pros right now.
And I think NFL teams want to see whether some of that game speed stuff that you were mentioning is just is that just him, and he's just going to have trouble when against higher competition and a lot of extra pressure and like all these sort of things that take experience to sort of get through, or is that second season really going to help him in sort of overcoming some of those things?
Real quick with Garrett, just to recap kind of what he's done this year. He's got the third most prolific season as a passer in LSU history with 3,735 yards, behind Burrow and Daniels' Heisman seasons. But 26 touchdowns to 11 picks, with a couple of fumbles lost too. So it's those turnovers that are a big piece. We see that he can be, he had a probably better first season than Jaden or Joe did as starters in terms of his just prolificness as a passer. There's still things that they did better in terms of like protecting the football and stuff. I think, you can probably pick that apart deeper down the road. But all to say, like, very promising first season as a starter. And if he takes his second step and ends up being like, I don't know, maybe once again, high 3,000s, maybe even 4,000 yard passer with 30 touchdowns and like 8 interceptions instead of 11. I have a hard time seeing Garrett throw only 4 picks like Jaden did, but maybe if he can only throw like somewhere around 6 to 8, which is what I was kind of hoping for him coming into the season, and he ends up throwing 11 of them, then you start to talk about this guy as like, oh yeah, he's a first rounder without any question about it.
Yeah. So that's the decision from Garrett's point of view, and whether he still actually has meaningful conversations with his family to take place, or if he's just waiting for the opportunity to like post the graphic and the Wolf of Wall Street video and those sorts of things, like I'm coming back, or I'm not leaving, I guess. But from an LSU perspective, this is really important, and I kind of want to frame this in terms of the SEC. And this is going to be today's Around the SEC segment, which is brought to you by Classic Industrial Services, because at Classic Industrial Services, every minute matters. If Nuss comes back, and we don't know everybody else who's coming back. We don't know if Jalen Milroe will be back at Alabama. We don't know who might transfer in. We assume Quinn Ewers and Carson Beck are probably gone. Lenora Sellers will be back. DJ Lagway will be back. Marcel Reed will be back at Texas A&M. There's going to be other good quarterbacks, Jackson Arnold at Oklahoma. But I would think if Garrett Nussmeier comes back, LSU's probably got a preseason All-SEC, at least second-team pick, if not first-team pick. He's going to be right at the top of the conference, I would think.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just we're not in the most, I guess, prosperous time for quarterbacks in college football right now.
I should have mentioned Nico Iamaleava at Tennessee also.
But we're still not in the most prosperous time for quarterbacks right now, and really all of college football. I think we're probably gonna get like our first non-quarterback to win the Heisman in a while, and even I think the two favorites to at least get to be a finalist, I think those guys are almost certainly off the NFL or running out of eligibility in Dylan Gabriel's case. I just feel like if Nussmeier was one of the 15 best quarterbacks in the country this year, which I feel like that's safe to say, it's hard to not put him in the top 10 in the country, in the top or in the top 2 or 3 in the SEC heading into next season if he decides to come back.
Well, so we mentioned some of the other names, and Arch Manning also, by the way, is probably starting at Texas next year. That's another name to throw into that ring. But even this year, with all the warts that we talked about on Garrett's season, he still was one of maybe 6 SEC quarterbacks you could throw him in a hat and say on a given week he might have been the best player. Like there was no dominant SEC quarterback. So if he does come back, I think it's a fair expectation to say he would be one of the top guys in the conference.
Yeah, I was just sort of like looking down this list. I mean, Jackson Dart will be gone, like you said. I feel like DJ Lagway was so impressive, especially in the second half of the year for Florida once he became the starter.
Lenore Sellers, too.
Sellers as well, yeah. And I feel like it would be basically like Lagway, Sellers, Nussmeier, and then Nico would probably be in that conversation as well. He hasn't had a great year. I think Nuss has been better, but we know there's potential there for him, especially, again, like we're kind of the same things we're talking about with Garrett. If he comes back as a second-year starter and is able to build on that and improve, especially as a more consistent passer, then he could be one of the best quarterbacks in the SEC. And there were so many good players that left the SEC last year, Jaden being the best of the quarterbacks to go, that it's not shocking, I guess, that the SEC is down in terms of quarterback play across the league, but it's the sort of regression or stagnation of Carson Beck and Jalen Milroe is probably what's done it the most in the league in terms of like not having super high level quarterback play. But you got some young players there, like you said, with Lagway and Sellers, and then Garrett's not young, but a first year starter where he comes back and certainly one of the top 4 quarterbacks in the SEC next year. I would say probably top 3 going into the season.
All right, today's episode of the LSU Sports Insider is brought to you by Classic Industrial Services, proudly serving Louisiana and the entire United States with high-quality scaffolding erection and rental services, metal siding and roofing, and much more. From large capital projects to commercial projects or your small quick response needs, Classic Industrial is your go-to for quality and safety. They're not just about business, they're a proud community partner, supporting local initiatives and helping build a stronger Baton Rouge. Because at Classic Industrial Services, every minute matters. Okay, moving on from the Nuss conversation, a couple of other guys who, maybe BK meant when he was talking about key players returning. And the first one is tight end Mason Taylor. He was a key guy at times for this LSU team that for the first time in a long time didn't have a first-round talent at wide receiver. And so Nussmeier relied on him, Koki, and I think getting him back, that's a security blanket for a quarterback.
That would be absolutely massive. I'm fairly skeptical that will happen just because I feel like if you're an NFL team, you kind of know what this guy is. He's a very reliable pair of hands. He's an underrated athlete. He does a really good job of catching the ball and quickly getting upfield. He has excellent hands. I mean, mature kid. Like I don't know. He seems like he's played under Brian Kelly, who has a long history of developing tight ends for the next level. Like I have trouble seeing what would be the reasons why Mason Taylor would come back. I guess he could just come back because he wants to play with Garrett Nussmeier for another season and do that. But if he wants to be an NFL player and sort of follow in the footsteps of his dad a little bit, who was obviously a Hall of Fame caliber guy as a defensive end, I have trouble seeing why he won't go off to the NFL. It's not the greatest tight end class either, so he can sort of shoot up the boards maybe a little bit more there. And I don't know if blocking is necessarily his strength, but I don't think it's a major weakness either. So I think he's going to be an NFL player. I would be a little surprised if he came back.
I would be as well. I mean, he finished the year with 55 catches, 546 yards, and 2 touchdowns. He has the LSU all-time records now for receptions and yards by a tight end. And he did that fairly early in the season because he's been a 3-year starter. That's the other thing. It's like, how much more tape can he give teams to evaluate? Like, how much more better could his tape really be next year? Like, I mean, he already had a fantastic season this year, other than like going for like 1,000 yards and like having like a Brock Bowers-esque season. How much more could he really do? And that's kind of, you don't see that stuff very often. So
and
I
on
feel
the flip
like
side, you're risking injury, all that sort of stuff.
That too. And it looks like he's pretty much a consensus top 4 tight end in this draft class. So it's like you're going to be I would be surprised if he slipped past the third round.
Yeah.
And
Day
it's
two
like
pick.
if you're going to be a top 3 round pick, you should go. So I would
At
be
that
surprised
position,
in particular.
You should go.
Yeah.
So just to recap, we're in agreement here. Garrett Nussmeier is a yes. We're predicting him to come back. Mason Taylor is a no.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Third one is right tackle Emery Jones, who I think a lot of people thought he's gone. He's a first-round pick, all that sort of thing. Is starting reading tea leaves and things like that is starting to look like maybe he's a candidate to come back.
Yeah, I mean, he came into the year, him and Will Campbell, as sort of in those very potential first-round pick conversations. And Will Campbell is still in that conversation, even though he slipped out of maybe being a top 6-7 pick into maybe more of a top 15 to 20 pick. Hasn't had still had a good year, but not quite the way we've seen him play the last couple seasons. And then Emery Jones as well is like still in draft conversations. I was looking at some of the ESPN like big board stuff and like top 10 player rankings, and he still shows up there, but it's closer to like 7 to 10 range. And I don't exactly know what that means for like what round he would be picked in, but he's not going to be a first round pick. And if he could still maybe end up being a top 100 pick, but in that case, it's like, okay, what does he see himself as? Does he see himself as no, I can be a first round pick? In that case, you should come on back to school. And this is again where Brian Kelly kind of last week referenced this, was he was talking about the offensive line on his radio show and player retention. And he said that he's like, look, we're gonna get some of these offensive linemen back. Well, Will Campbell, like we said, is likely leaving.
You're not leaving it. You're not saying if you're a first round
Exactly.
pick. I think that's
Garrett Dellinger is a senior who has no more eligibility. Miles Frazier has no more eligibility. The only person that statement really applies to would be Emery Jones. So that's what I think also, and just things that we've kind of, rumor mill over the last, I guess, second half of the season and that kind of thing. Because he's had kind of an up and down year at times. Maybe LSU gives him the chance to kick over to left tackle if Will Campbell leaves, or maybe at least gives him the chance to stick at right tackle. We'll see. I feel like they give him the chance to maybe kind of boost up his draft stock again. And so it's an interesting decision for him, because he could still be drafted high enough to where it makes sense for him to leave, but he could come back and maybe do even more for a stock.
When it comes to Emery Jones, what sort of rattles around in my head is the whole over the cap, under the cap situation that Brian Kelly was talking about last week when it came to just potentially having some more NIL dollars to throw around for some of these guys. And that was mostly in the context of the portal, but it could also be in the context of a guy like, Emery Jones. Like if they can maybe not match a second round evaluation, but at least get close to it money-wise, then I can see him, coming back, and for all the reasons that you said, and for financial reasons as well. So I that's a guy who I think it might come down to dollars and cents for him as much as all the other NFL and player evaluation parts of it too.
But yeah, it was really, just real quick, it was really interesting hearing Brian Kelly last week during his radio show be like, we're gonna hyping up the retention on the offensive line, when again that's like the one guy it truly I think applies to.
I think you're right. I mean, I guess we'll just throw this out there. Is there any chance, a 1% chance, that he meant Will Campbell?
I mean,
maybe.
1%? Yeah, I think you'd have to give it some kind of percentage that isn't zero.
They put together they took the Bryce Underwood money and said, hey, Will.
Well, the only thing, the case for Will Campbell coming back isn't as much to do with money, because they're not going to match a first round. They may have more money this offseason, but they're not going to match a first round NFL draft pick contract. But I mean, Will Campbell spoke to us, like 2 weeks ago, and he was not happy about the season, the way this team has played, the fact that at the very beginning of the year, he said it's a failure if you don't win a national championship at LSU. And we know how much this guy loves LSU. We know he's probably had tons of opportunities to, go to other schools and make a lot more money, but he's decided to stay here. He loves this program. He wants to win here. He's been going to games since he was a small kid. Driving down from the Monroe area. Mm-hmm. Maybe he just absolutely loves this place and wants to win a national championship here, and that would be the only case. Similar to what happened to Ohio State last offseason with JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer and those guys returning despite being potential first round picks.
Really want to come back and beat Michigan. Oops.
Yeah. The one thing with Will, I mean, I was watching down in the field after the game, and he was hugging his mom and taking pictures with his family and kind of soaking it in a little bit, which you don't normally do if you don't think it's your last home game.
Yeah. So just again to recap, Emery Jones. It sounds like that's who BK meant, and so I think we have to say yes, he's coming back. If we had to guess,
that would be my prediction. But on the confidence meter, like whereas Nuss, I would say I have my confidence there is like a 9. Emery would be closer to like a 6.
Okay.
I'd say I put it at a 4, so I'm actually, it's like the
leaning
gladiator
toward him
thumbs
going.
down.
Okay.
Yeah,
All
for
right.
me. But but again, like there's not a big difference between 6 and a 4. It's close. I think it's gonna be close.
Let's not kill him though. Let's not. The gladiator thumbs down means
That's true. But like if this is like 50 though, Yeah.
All right, so we got a couple more to talk about. We're going to talk about some injured players. First, we're going to take our second break here on the LSU Sports Insider.
You know how far I've gone, now I'm home again. I'm feeling more alive these days than I've ever been.
At the Baton Rouge Clinic, our sole focus is to provide exceptional health care for your entire family so that you can get back to doing what you love most. We are caring for generations.
You gave me love.
Since 1988, Classic Industrial Services, Inc. has led the industry in specialty contracting. From thermal insulation to scaffolding, coatings, and beyond, we cover it all. Every minute matters in our commitment to quality and safety. We're here to serve with roofing, siding, heat trace, and refractory services. Visit classicindustrial.com for more information.
Okay, continuing our discussion here about which LSU players could be coming back that Brian Kelly may have mentioned. We do want to mention a guy who's injured, and we've talked about this before, but this will be today's injury report, which is brought to you by the Baton Rouge Clinic, your trusted healthcare provider in the heart of Baton Rouge. Whether you're in need of primary care, specialist services, or urgent care, the Baton Rouge Clinic has you covered with a team of dedicated and experienced professionals. Visit BatonRougeClinic.com to learn more or to schedule your appointment today. The Baton Rouge Clinic, caring for generations. And that, of course, is Harold Perkins, guys. He out for the season. Jacoby Guillory also out for the season, already said, hey, I'm coming back. I don't want it to end like that. So that's sort of, Perkins, and we've mentioned this before, Koki, he's kind of a tweener at the NFL level. Like, it doesn't have a true position, so I don't know how high he'd be drafted, especially off of the injury. So I think he's certainly a candidate to come back.
He's definitely a candidate to come back. I'm not quite as confident in him coming back as I am with someone like Garrett Nussmeier, but I'm a little more confident in him coming back than someone like Emery Jones. Does that sort of make sense?
So you're between the 4 and the 9.
Yeah, I'm between the 4 and the 9. I'm like a 6 or a 7, something like that. And I think like there's a strong case against him coming back, and it's just the fact that the NFL drafts athletes. He's an incredible athlete, and someone will just talk themselves into drafting him. It could be as early as the early second round or even late first round if someone has an extra first round pick or something. Like, that could very well happen. That would not surprise me at all. But there's also a lot of reasons for Harold personally for why he would want to come back to college football and LSU. And it's just because he wants to prove himself as a middle linebacker as a football player, right? And that's something that he has yet to do. And given how the season was cut short, there's probably some unfinished business he has in terms of trying to prove that aspect of his game, and he can also improve his stock as an NFL player if he really takes big leaps with playing that middle linebacker role. So it'll be very interesting to see what he decides to do.
Talking to NFL draft analysts right after his injury, they said he could still maybe be a top 50 pick because of the athletic potential. The problem is the thing that nobody knows at the moment is how much pre-draft testing can he do? Because if you're a guy like him who is going to be in large part drafted off of athletic potential, because the way that this season began, where he wasn't super productive, and he is that sort of what is his position conversation is going to continue even more at the next level. You need to be able to show off your athleticism. He's a guy who could probably run in like the 4.3s and the 40 and be incredibly quick in all the agility drills. But if he's still recovering from the ACL injury, then it's unknown how much he would be able to do. And so then that maybe affects your stock as well. And so I think that's something else that will be a factor for Harold in his decision making. In terms of LSU, like they're actually pretty solid at the linebacker position going into next year. You lose Greg Penn, but West Weeks is going to be able to come back. He did not play in the Oklahoma game, so he will be eligible to return after redshirting this year. You've got, all 3 Weeks brothers, and there's some thinking that maybe Zach can even contribute in some ways as a freshman.
The month.
Yeah, exactly. And then Devon Keys played really well toward the end of the season, showed a lot of promising signs. But Harold, if he does come back, there'll still continue to be those conversations of how do you use this guy?
Yeah.
And if LSU can figure it out, and then he can shoot himself back up into the first round, and that's probably what's kind of going through his head and their head. And also LSU again with like the reallocation of NIL dollars, that could probably help here. Where if his draft stock is, hey, you might be a top 100 pick, but it's not a sure thing. Maybe you even fall to like the third. Like, I'd be surprised if we fell past the third round, I think, because of the athletic potential. But we see crazy stuff happen in the draft all the time. It's hard to project. And so if LSU can kind of craft a good NIL package for him to kind of make the money all the same, then he might benefit from that as well.
Fascinating case, I think, because on one hand you have a guy who's a freak athlete and could get drafted real high, but also could benefit from returning and showing that he has a positional home. Also, you mentioned NIL. We mentioned Guillory saying he didn't want it to end like that. Maybe Harold feels the same way. And then the injury aspect of it. You have to know, hey, if I'm going to enter the draft, am I going to be physically able to show that I'm healthy before the draft? Otherwise, I'm hurting my draft stock. But you have to make the decision before maybe you know that for sure. So it's just a fascinating case in a lot of different ways. Before we wrap this up, guys, anybody else?
Do we want to like make a prediction?
Oh yeah, make a prediction on Harold.
We did with the other three.
Yeah.
So
a confidence meter, a 6 out of 7, so it's a slight yes. Okay, he comes back.
I guess I put mine at more like a 5, just because I would have always thought coming into this season, like, okay, this will be like Harold's last season, and then when the injury complicates that, but I guess I don't know. Maybe I'll give it a 6 as well, like with Emery Jones. I think both of those two are going to be really close, whereas. And I'll lean toward the positive yes on it, but I could see a situation where he leaves, and I could see a situation where Emery leaves too. But I'll go this slight lean yes on Harold too at the moment.
And part of
if
this
I'm placing it today, remember this could change.
Yeah, and part of this is just Brian Kelly sort of being like, well, we're going to get a few big names back, and they just haven't announced it yet, and that sort of gives me the feeling that they've either maybe not had these conversations directly, but he's gotten enough hints to say that, to be able to say that publicly. Maybe this, blows up in my face and blows up in Brian Kelly's face when I'm saying that right now. But just hearing that made me think that, okay, there's at least a real shot of this happening. If not, it will happen for sure.
And that is where we come in with last season's historical context. When Brian Kelly was asked about the defensive tackle position at signing day, and he said they felt good about retention, and then they lost both of their draft eligible juniors in Mason Smith and Mekhi Wingo, 2 guys who they really wanted to come back, and they lost both of them. So this sometimes these things get said and they do not come to fruition. So yes, Brian Kelly pumped quite a bit of positivity about this after the game Saturday, but now LSU has to close because those conversations have started. Like they already said that we already know CJ Daniels is coming back. That's a decision that's already been made. They've started having these conversations, but they now need to finalize everything because even though he thinks they might be coming back, we've seen in the past that has not always panned out. And so I think these are all the kind of the guys, maybe these 4 who we've discussed who would be like the big fish, the big ones where they got him to come back, who would really back up that statement that Brian Kelly made. And now they've got to finish that out to try to get the guys back who they feel like they can retain on this roster.
It is a very fluid thing.
Very much so.
Brian Kelly on Saturday night might have felt one way, and he may feel differently by tomorrow. I mean, we just don't know because maybe a draft grade comes back in higher than a guy expected. And maybe I will go in the draft. Maybe the NIL offer gets upped. Maybe I will stay in school. I mean, it's very fluid. And to that end, there's other guys who the transfer portal's out there. There's some other draft eligible players who technically could say, hey, I'm done with school. I want to go, even if I'm a day 3 pick in the draft or whatever, I want that part of my life to begin. So it's all fluid, and it's something we got to follow over the next few weeks here.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the only other guy who had a really good season this year who was also draft eligible is technically Aaron Anderson, because he's a redshirt sophomore. This was his 3rd year of college. And he had a really good season. But, I mean, after doing that story on Aaron, it sounds like he definitely wants to be a first-round pick and become the guy in LSU's receiver room. He has a very, very good chance of doing at least one of those things next season. And I think right now he's not a first-round pick, either way you look at it, despite how productive he was. And I think I don't know if he wants to prove this, but he probably needs to prove that he can be more than just an awesome slot player and can also play on the outside. And I don't really know what exactly he needs to do to get to that as a smaller guy, but at the same time, like, that's kind of the next step of his potential development if you're looking for things to potentially improve on and improve on his stock.
The other thing with him would also be like, he showed on Saturday that was the guy that LSU thought they were getting as a special teams player, as a returner when he transferred from Alabama. And if he can maybe carve out a role alongside Xavier Thomas next year in that regard, that could also help his stock, because someone of his size might need to be able to do both things in the NFL. And yes, he had a great season. I'm not trying to take away from it. 784 yards, 53 catches, 5 touchdowns. But we're kind of used to seeing like a great LSU wide receiver season be over 1,000 yards.
I mean, he could come back and be Devontae Smith, right? Like, he could have that type of impact at his ceiling. I don't want to say he's going to win the Heisman.
I was going to say
but he's that type of
There are different kinds of players too, I think. Smitty's more of a...
Smith's a little longer. He can play a little bit more on the outside, a little bit easier. Yeah. It's just like Anderson's size does sort of... it'll put him in a box for at least a lot of teams in terms of like, oh, this is a slot-only player, and that kind of hurts his potential first-round value.
I think statistically more than anything else.
Okay, yeah. I mean, that would be a lot, but I think if he can go over 1,000 yards, then he ends up putting himself
the Brian
in a
Thomas
really
season
good
last year. I mean, that's possible, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's lofty too. If he goes over 1,000 yards, like after
Wilson's
having 700, I'm just trying to provide like a benchmark, like, because we've seen a lot of LSU receivers have that kind of season, and if he can do that and continue to build off of what he did this year and show, like you said, a more variety in how he gets used, then yeah, he makes himself a first or second round pick. I mean, I think his game could maybe be more like. I don't know. Because I don't see a Devontae Smith comp there, and Tyreek Hill is so fast and dynamic that it's hard to put that one too. But it's like I feel like he's closer to game style than that, than Devontae Smith necessarily. But we're getting into maybe too deep of a conversation about Aaron Anderson at the moment. Yeah. The other thing I was just going to mention would be Chris Hilton. He's a redshirt junior, so he is draft eligible. He's not going to go to the draft. He has not produced enough. He's been too injured during his career. But that's just someone to keep an eye on in the weeks ahead. Does he come back to LSU? Does he hit the portal after just kind of not being able to get started here? But we saw what is possible when he's healthy in that Oklahoma game. The downfield threat that LSU was lacking all year finally made a difference there in that game. And so that's just someone else to keep an eye on as a redshirt junior. Sage Ryan. Same situation. He's got another year of eligibility, but he is participated on senior night. And so that can sometimes be an indication a guy's going to leave. Not always, but just someone else to keep an eye on there as well. Those are some of the main ones that I'm kind of looking out for in terms of guys who are like getting close to the end of their eligibility, but are still going to have a decision to make. Okay, so we've been picking which LSU players will return. We got to make one more pick before we go here. This is the LSU Sports Insider's sports betting segment, proudly sponsored by the Queen of Baton Rouge. Experience the thrill of game day at 1717 Kitchen and Cocktails, your premier destination for elevated sports entertainment. And that is which SEC team will or could join the playoff conversation. And we've got the odds up here. I put Miami's odds up also. If you look at the odds at DraftKings, Alabama's like even money favorite to get that pick. You've also got South Carolina in there, Miami, and then kind of the long shot is Ole Miss, which I don't know, surprises me a little bit. They've got the head-to-head win in dominant fashion over Ole Miss, but just based on rankings, I think Alabama's your favorite. Is that who you guys would pick for that last college football playoff spot, or are you going a different direction?
Personally, I think Ole Miss is the best team out of those three and should be picked for that last spot. But if I had to say which team will get in, and that's not based on my prediction, just based on what the committee's doing, I'd say it's probably Alabama. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I'm trying to say too. I'm a little surprised that Alabama's the favorite, but I think given the brand name recognition, all of that, the fact that they're ranked higher coming in, Alabama's probably the team. Wilson?
I don't know. It would just be annoying if it was Alabama, frankly.
Maybe that's what we're all trying to say.
It's like, I mean, because they've looked so vulnerable at times this year. That was a bad loss to Oklahoma.
They lost to Oklahoma and Vanderbilt.
I know. And that's the thing. And so it's like, okay, so you start getting into the weeds on this, and it's like all of these SEC teams, I don't know that any of these three are deserving of being in the college football playoff this year at 9-3. The SEC has beat up on each other all season. And what I think some of this weekend told me was of all the years to have where you could argue that it should be 4 deserving SEC teams, like this is not the season.
No.
And to me, I think Miami should be in over the other ones.
Oh, really? Wow. Interesting.
Okay. I mean, I just don't know. Like, also, we've seen the committee a lot this year end up basically just ranking it kind of pretty close to like wins and loss record. And you're going to get so into the weeds on trying to discern between Alabama, Ole Miss, and South Carolina that I think they could all just end up kind of canceling each other out.
Well, the other possibility is that Clemson beats SMU in the ACC championship game, and then SMU is also in this conversation.
In which case, SMU, I think, gets in over everybody
I think
else.
SMU gets in over all these teams, but I would take at least 2, if not all 3 of the SEC teams over Miami, which just personally, I mean, as someone who watches a decent amount of the games, like I just feel like Miami is very similar to last year's LSU team, but they're just in the ACC. Like their defense is pretty miserable to watch. They probably should have 3 or 4 losses right now instead of just 2. And their last 2 losses were pretty decent teams, like Georgia Tech, and we saw what Georgia Tech did to Georgia, right? Mm-hmm. And then Syracuse has won 9 games, so credit to them. But at the same time, like there was that crazy Virginia Tech game with the Hail Mary. There's the Cal game where they probably should have got called for that targeting call.
They could easily be 6-6.
Exactly,
They
like
could easily be 6-6.
It's just a really thin case for them.
And well, you made the point though that I think matters this year, which is. Well, matters every year. Results on the field matter. Georgia Tech pushed Georgia to the absolute brink. And if we're going to say that Georgia is one of the best teams in the SEC, might go and win the SEC championship, and almost lost to Georgia Tech, which, lost to Miami 28-23. Excuse me, no, Miami which beat Miami.
Yeah, they beat Miami.
It's like, is the SEC that much more dominant than everybody else this year? I don't think so. And so it's, we're kind of, I think, sometimes getting lost in historical precedents, historical domination by the league. But the results on the field this year matter. It was the whole Indiana conversation.
Yeah.
I thought that was very silly that Indiana, a Big Ten team, was just getting sort of hung out to dry just because they hadn't played anybody. And they had not played a team with I think it was going into that Ohio State game, it was like one win with one team with a winning record at the time, and it was Washington. And, but the SEC just doesn't have that dominance this year that it has in the past, and I don't know that they should, any of these 9-3 teams should just be considered over Miami, which is at the moment 10-2 and 3rd place in the ACC. I feel like Miami is maybe a more deserving candidate than any of these SEC teams.
I'll say this: I think the SEC, if you look at any computer rankings, or anything, it's still clearly the best conference, but it's so much more balanced this year. Outside of Mississippi State. Anybody could be, even Kentucky, who went 1-7 in the league, beat Ole Miss at Ole Miss. Like, it's so balanced, but at the top, they don't have the 3 or 4 dominant teams like it seems like the SEC usually does.
And it's really tough because I have trouble saying that the league isn't as dominant as we want. I think, even though I do think the Georgia Tech game was like a really kind of almost an eye-opening sort of moment for the league, but. I feel like we're not going to really know the answer to that question, I feel like, until we get to the end of this road in the national championship game. Mm-hmm. Let's see who's playing who. Let's see how many of these SEC teams make it to the semis or even the quarters, or how the results sort of play out, right? So that's kind of the thing that I'm kind of waiting for before I say, oh, the SEC's falling off or anything like that.
Remember, if we're talking about SEC stuff, Miami, I mean, it was week 1. These teams are different than they were back then. They beat Florida 41-17.
But also Clemson could win the ACC, and they
got
lost both
trounced
of
by
their
Georgia.
SEC games. So
Yeah, they got absolutely trounced in week 1. Again, that's the one SEC game that Miami has played. So.
All right, Tiger fans, you can catch all the sports action at the Queen Casino's DraftKings Sportsbook Bar. They've got big screens, they've got live betting, they've got the cold beer, all that kind of stuff. It's the only land-based casino in Baton Rouge, so check them out. That's going to do it for our show today. We're actually going to be back a little earlier this week than usual because we are going to do a signing day primer. Signing day is on Wednesday. We're going to talk about the recruits LSU has coming in and maybe some of the decisions that those high school athletes still have to make. So in the meantime, subscribe to our YouTube channel, sign up for notifications, hit the like button, all of that good stuff. For our producer, Amelia Cotton, he's Koki Riley and Wilson Alexander. I'm Zach Ewing, and we will see you next time.